I wanted to first ask you about there has been a lot of anger from the Eurozone about the IMF announcing it will visit Russia to evaluate its economy for the first time since the conflict in Ukraine began in February of 2022. I also wanted to ask you about this in the context of both your new book, Understanding Capitalism, and comments made by Vladislav Inozemstev, who is an economist at the very unfriendly to Russia MEMRI Institute, which is actually Middle East focused. But he had this to say to Euro News, and I'm just gonna read it briefly. He said about sanctions that firstly, the sanctions do not have a critical impact on the economy of Russia as a whole. It's been reoriented to the domestic economy, and the budget has suffocated the problem with money. Sanctions have not paralyzed the military industrial complex or provoked anti war mobilization. Thirdly, they are, after all, sanctions, that is, a double edged sword. Professor Wolf, in terms of this double edged sword, he means that there has been a lot of blowback. Could you talk about sanctions in the context of both your new book and also what has been the true impact of these sanctions on Russia and the world since they began 2+ years ago?
Sure. Let me start with sanctions. There really now is a considerable literature which is either being ignored in Washington and Western Europe, which is what I guess is happening, or they may not even know about it, which is possible, but even more detrimental to them. And that literature says that they don't work. The basic message is between what countries can do to minimize them and what they can do to evade them and what they can do to offset them, all three, minimize, evade, offset, and each of those in different ways, both countries and companies and individuals can escape sanctions. It's just the way it is. But perhaps the most important thing that is often left out that I could add to that literature, and why the professor you quote is quite right in saying that this is what has happened in the case of Russia. They've evaded some, they've used their monetary system to offset others. But perhaps the things that are not understood is that war, in one way or another, can serve as a stimulus to offset declining economic well-being. The Russians are not the first ones to do that, to show that, to discover that. The irony here is the United States. We suffered the worst collapse of capitalism in its history so far, the 1930s. For 11 years at least, from 1929 to 1940, the American capitalist system collapsed. And all the efforts, first of Republican Hoover administration, then of the successive Franklin Roosevelt administrations, were unable to get us out of it, even though they tried in their ways. What did finally work was war. The Second World War did what? To be very simple, but to give you an idea, it took half of the millions of unemployed Americans and put them in a uniform. And it took the other half of unemployed Americans and put them in the factories to make the uniforms. Everybody got a job. Everybody got an income. All those people spent their income that they got from their job, and that stimulated the economy to produce again what it had always been capable of, but it lacked the stimulus of sufficient effective demand from an employed working class, which the war solved. Its story is a little different in Russia today, but it's not all that different. You had an economy with plenty of problems, Russia, but the war has been a stimulus and has helped them. So if the point was to bring Russia to its knees, which President Biden and others said was the goal, that's why it was a 100% failure They haven't done that. They haven't destroyed the ruble. They haven't crippled the economy. None of it. And nobody should be surprised that when they applied what they called the mother of all sanctions, it didn't have the effect that they had proposed. The second thing I want to say, linking it to the book of Understanding Capitalism, is that if you understand capitalism today, not with the rose-colored glasses of cheerleader, which is what so many of our mainstream media and academics, I've been a professor of economics in the United States all my life, what most of our profession teaches, which is rah-rah capitalism, if you're able to get beyond the superficiality of that and to see the system for the mixture of success and failure, strength and weaknesses that it has, and then you're able to even take the next step of realizing that the empire of the United States is now coming to an end, and that the dynamics of capitalism have left the Western Hemisphere and moved east, which everyone ought to understand. But we don't here in the United States. We are cheerleaders. So we made a terrible miscalculation. When the sanctions were applied to Russia by the people who believed they would have these effects, which they didn't, the reason they didn't have the effects is also, in addition to what I've said, the allies that the Russians now have. Above all, this thing called the BRICS, B-R-I-C-S, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and half a dozen more countries that joined since. Russia turned to them. And what damage could have been done by the sanctions never even became an issue because India and China particularly stepped up and were good allies and have been ever since, as I'm speaking to you, for the Russians. But that's not so much about the Russians as about the United States not understanding that the world economy is not what it was because American capitalism is not what it was and is not capable of doing what it once was capable of doing. It's very hard for people to understand basic changes, especially when they carry negative implications. But that's the truth of where we are. And it's being shown to us, for example, by the colossal failure in the Ukraine.
Yeah, and the narrative in the Western media has been that more can be done now. So it was that these sanctions were going to bring down Russia. And now there's a lot of clamor in the Western media that more can be done and some alarmism about sanctions actually working. Unlike what the Russian economists are saying at the MEMRI Institute, there's a lot of reports about China not being able to settle payments with its bigger state banks with Russia. But even in these reports, you have, for example, in Business Insider saying that Russia is still receiving payments for raw materials such as oils and grains, and its payment for China's key technologies are also still getting through. And that the big problem is that there's money in limbo with smaller banks, and this is hurting smaller firms. Professor Wolf, could you help educate the audience about exactly why it is that the United States and the Western media are so focused on these small issues, it seems like, with sanctions and this enthusiasm that more can be done when, in fact, it looks like more cannot be done? Could you help educate the audience on this contradiction?
Sure, I'd be glad to. I've been following these things now for decades, and there's an unmistakable pattern that gets reproduced. Over the last 30 to 40 years, what we have in the People's Republic of China is really nothing short of a historical, epic achievement. It will be noted for decades, for centuries to come. And this has nothing to do with whether you like or don't like the Chinese Communist Party or Xi Jinping or socialism or capital. It had nothing to do with that. It has to do with what they have actually been able to do on the ground in building up an economy. 40 years ago, they were the largest country by population on earth. They were also one of the poorest countries on earth. They had just come to the end of 100 years, as they call it there, 100 years of humiliation, in which they barely held on to their independence while Western colonial powers of one kind or another took over cities, regions, industries, in which, opium was a national disaster, wiping out whole sections of major Chinese cities. And it's endless. For those of you who might really want to learn about it, an American missionary named Pearl Buck wrote a book way back when called The Good Earth. You read that, you will understand the poverty of a broken down, dying system 40 years ago. Okay, it had been conquered by a revolution, a communist revolution, back in 1949. But that communist revolution inherited one of the poorest corners on the planet. What happened in 40 years is incredible. China is now the first major economic competitor of the United States in a century. The last century has been the American Empire. We took over from the British Empire. The Chinese are now a competitor. The Americans that I'm talking about, we haven't had an economic competitor for a century. Russia might have been a challenge when it was the Soviet Union, politically and ideologically, but economically, not at all. It isn't now either. The GDP, the gross domestic product of Russia, which is a rough measure of its size, total output of goods and services in a year, is about $1.5 trillion to $2 trillion. The United States GDP is $23-24 trillion. There's David and Goliath. There's no competition. There's no economic danger from Russia. It's too small. It's too underdeveloped. Might get there one day. The GDP of China is about 18 trillion. That's a whole different ballgame. People don't even know that in the United States, and you can't understand the world if you don't have at least some rough idea of the relative size of the players. If Russia has dealings with China, it's dealing with something much, much bigger and richer than itself, and the country that's in a position to help Russia in lots and lots of ways, which has gone on. All right, over these 40 years as the Chinese grow, and by the way, the average rate of growth over those last 30 to 40 years in China has been 6 to 9% per year. Over the same period in the United States, 2.5%, maybe 3% a year. Not even close. That's why they caught up. And you can dance all you want around how and why, but that's the reality. Okay, why am I telling you this? Because at every step, starting 40 years ago, the Western press was unwilling to credit what was coming out of China, what was being said by the Chinese leaders. We are growing, we're expanding. Oh, we can now hire 1 million more workers. And we can now have our first big ocean liner. And now we have really rapid railroad. Oh, we have a faster railroad than you do in the United States. Isn't that odd? We have high tech. We have the best telephone in the world. We have. At every step, it was said Chinese statistics are phony. It was only when large numbers of Americans went to China, got on the rapid rail that flies through half the cities of that country, to realize that they're ahead of the United States in such transportation, far ahead. Then we have what you're asking about. When you can't challenge anymore, because the world won't let you, the obvious arrival of China as a major economic power in the world, second only to the United States and catching up fast. Now, what do? You recognize that? No. Celebrate it? Of course not. Try to understand it even, not much. But you can find something else to pick at. Oh, their property values are overinflated. By the way, they are. Or they're pumping a lot of money into their economy. By the way, they are. That's what economies like that do. They have problems and then they solve them. At least that's what the Chinese have done. And that's what, by the way, we do here in the West too. You can paint a silly picture by only talking about each problem as it arises, no matter how small, blowing it out of proportion, partly by not talking about all the successes. Around the world, the biggest success the Chinese have shown the world is they've lifted about 800 million people out of the level of extreme poverty. No other country has done that. No other continent has done that in the last 10 or 20 years. Everyone in the world knows that you either buy the super high-tech stuff from the United States or you buy it from China. Those are the two places that now produce it. If you're not familiar, let me give you perhaps the most recent example. 10 or 15 years ago, a competition began among all the major automobile producers in the world to produce an electric automobile in place of the gasoline fuel-driven automobile. Everybody's working on that. Okay, come 15 years after they start, they're there. They got it. They got electric cars and electric trucks. As I'm speaking to you, the best quality electric vehicles are made in China, and they are the lowest cost as well as the highest quality. In other words, there was a competition, and the Chinese won. Not Tesla, not Elon Musk, not General Motors, all of whom are busy in China making cars and selling it in China for a major part of their profits. So they depend on China, but they didn't win that competition. Here's the name of the company in case you haven't heard of it. B as in boy, Y as in yellow, D as in dog. The BYD Corporation is the great success story. But you wouldn't know it in the United States, partly because you wouldn't see the car here. Why? Because we have a better car? Not at all. We have a 100% tariff. In other words, if a car comes from China, costs $30,000, you can't buy it in the United States for the $30,000 that the Chinese producer, BYD, will sell it to you for. Because Uncle Sam comes in and says, you got to give Uncle Sam 100% of that. In other words, the price doubles. The car, if you bought it in the United States, would cost you $60,000. That is how the United States deals with having lost the competition. Somebody else does it better, cheaper. Once upon a time, and even now on the 4th of July, we talk about a society committed to competition. Yeah, but that's only when the outcome is suitable. It's like elections. You like them, except when the outcome isn't suitable. And then that's where we are at this point. So I'm not worried. If you want me to hear that the Chinese have economic problems, I'm with you. They do. I study them. They're there. The Chinese talk about them. No big secret. And they're working on them. And some of them they solve well, and some of them they do a bad job. They make mistakes, like everybody else. But that doesn't change the larger picture here, which is a childish game. Whether it's hitting them with tariffs or telling stories where you overblow this or that problem that they have, that's really a childish way of handling yourself. And you know, it reflects not so much on who you're talking about as on you to talk like that. It suggests a desperation in the United States to cover, to fake it, to protect. There's an enormous literature on the use of protection in economics. It goes back to the beginnings of the United States when we were still a colony of Britain. That history didn't go away. And one of the lessons of that history is, for a little while, yeah, you can use tariffs and protection to get yourself going. But you can't keep doing it, because otherwise it walls you off from the rest of the world and makes the cost of living in your country rise, because you can't take advantage of all that's being developed in the rest of the world. It's an old lesson. It has to be learned again, I guess, every generation. But we are about to condemn the American people to the cost of it. And if I have a moment, Danny, just to drive it home, every American company in the months and years ahead, whatever they produce, wristwatches, software programs, airplanes, whatever it is, every American company is going to be converting from its cars and trucks that are its business, that are burn fuel, to being electric. That's everybody's doing that sooner or later. That's what everyone's going to do. Now, in a foreign country, for example, Europe, where 1/4 of the electric vehicles on the road today are BYD electric vehicles from China. They, by the way, have a tariff, but much lower than the United States, so the Chinese cars come in. Everywhere in the world, the company that competes with an American company will be able to buy and use highest quality trucks at the lowest price. But the American company making toothbrushes here, for example, will have to pay much more, because we won't be able to buy the high quality, low cost Chinese truck because of the tariff. We'll have to buy a not as good, much more expensive GM or Ford or Stellantis or some other car. Rivian makes the trucks these days, but they're going to charge $40,000-$50,000 because they don't have the competition of the $30,000 Chinese truck. So yeah, we can get the electric trucks and cars, but our companies will have to pay much more. That's going to hurt them competitively. You, John, and you, Mary, are going to lose your job. You in Oregon and you in Nebraska. You'll never know why your little business that employed you went out of business, because they couldn't compete, since they couldn't get the best, cheapest electric truck that their competitor in Bangladesh was able to do.